Wow, so that video kind of popped off then, didn't it? First of all, I want to just thank everybody who's watched the video. I've gotten a lot of good feedback on it and some good comments, and even if you're just clicking through to see something else, then I really appreciate all the views that I've gotten on it. Obviously, there's an external reason for this video gaining some traction, and that's because Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate has become a hot commodity nowadays. And for good reason. I mean, Monster Hunter Rise is right around the corner, which we'll get into in a second, and the game is also on sale for $16, which is an insane value. I mean, I don't really feel like I need to run a commercial for these guys, but Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate is probably the most beefy of all the old school Monster Hunter games, and now it's available for like a fraction of the price of what it would usually be. Given the circumstances, I thought it'd be a good idea to make a bit of a follow-up video going more in depth about some of the talking points that I had in the original review, so if you haven't seen it yet, I'd suggest you check that out before watching the rest of this video. So let's talk about Monster Hunter Rise first, because that is also another factor as to why Generations Ultimate is making a bit of a comeback. Monster Hunter Rise is a big deal for a lot of reasons, but I think the primary reason is that there are going to be gigantic dogs that you can ride on like horses. I mean, the game pretty much sells itself at that point. It's probably going to be the biggest selling game of all time, at least better than all of them. In all seriousness though, Monster Hunter Rise is important for the Monster Hunter series as a whole. It's looking like it'll be the first sequel in the style of Monster Hunter World, which is important because World was a big turning point for the Monster Hunter franchise. Monster Hunter Rise will add another point to that line and give some trajectory to this new sequel series. Hopefully, it'll give us a good idea of where Capcom is attempting to take this series next. This is a bit more complicated than it seems though, because of the consoles that these games have been released on, or will be released on in the case of Monster Hunter Rise. All of the main entries in the series prior to Monster Hunter World had been originally released as home console exclusives. Monster Hunters 1 and 2 were released on the PlayStation 2, Monster Hunter 3 was released on the Wii, Monster Hunter 4 and Monster Hunter Generations were both originally released on the Nintendo 3DS. Monster Hunter World was the first multi-platform release in the series, being released on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and it also got a PC release. As I understand it, the philosophy behind Monster Hunter World's multi-platform release was to encourage a more worldwide appeal to the series. They took that approach to the design of the game as well, streamlining the gameplay to make it more user-friendly and upgrading the visual design and graphical fidelity. Monster Hunter Rise is planned to be released as a Nintendo Switch exclusive, which, in the context of the Monster Hunter franchise as a whole, is a bit of a return to form. It remains to be seen if the gameplay and design of that game is going to be a return to form for the series as a whole as well. We'll just have to wait and see to find out on that one. Since Rise is a Switch exclusive, it puts Generations Ultimate in a bit of a strange position. Here is a game that was designed to be a love letter to the older, more archaic ways of Monster Hunter. Now it's being used to introduce people to the series, where the next installment will, in all likelihood, be orders of magnitude more user-friendly than Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. It's kind of crazy, but it makes a bit of sense, especially if they're going to jack the price down so low that it makes the people who are on the fence about it a little more warm to the idea of picking it up. So here we are, back in Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate territory. First of all, I want to talk about some clarifications of some points that I made in my original review of the game. Then I'd like to say some elements of Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate that I'd like to see show up on Rise. I just want to take a second to point out how odd it is to me that my Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate review is picking up steam at all, because, quite frankly, the sound quality in that video is trash. I mean, I wasn't even using a real microphone, I was just recording off of whatever microphone the laptop was using at the time. If you use headphones, you can even hear my dad preheating the oven for DiGiorno. Their animations are playful, So as far as my original review goes, I still stand by all of the major points that I made. I mean, the game is super user-unfriendly, especially at the beginning. The Hunter Arts are run-of-the-mill special abilities that you'd see in any action RPG nowadays, and I did spend a lot of time in the Prowler mode, which I was not expecting. There was one comment that pointed out an issue that I think definitely could use a little bit of clarification. This comment is in reference to a comment that I made about the game's frame rate. I care about frame rate. Monster Hunter 4 on 3DS ran at 60 frames per second. This game should have 2. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with this take. Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate is technologically a step backwards from Monster Hunter 4, which was a 3DS release, for crying out loud. This doesn't exactly look great. However, and this is the point that I was trying to make in the original video, the difference between 60 frames per second and 30 frames per second is not so significant that I would consider a game run at 30 frames per second to be unplayable compared to a 60 frames per second game. In fact, I'd even argue that a game run at a stable, and this is the keyword here, stable 30 frames per second can still lead to a very fluid and enjoyable gaming experience. To be perfectly honest, I'm not entirely sure what the performance of Monster Hunter 4 is like on the 3DS because, as I've previously stated, I'm not a huge fan of handheld games, but we can look to Monster Hunter World for an example of a game that runs at 60 frames per second. Monster Hunter World, in all its visual glory, will still, to this day on my PlayStation 4, occasionally drop frames. Now, it's very rare, and I wouldn't necessarily consider that game-breaking either, but it's definitely more annoying to me than a steady 30 FPS. Of course, the discussion about frame rate does not and should not exist in a vacuum. This all has to do with resolution, processing power, unique assets, and a bunch of other technical mumbo-jumbo that, quite frankly, I couldn't give less of a fuck about. Don't get me wrong, I think that discussions about frame rate and resolution can be important in certain instances, i.e. when a game is straining under the weight of its own graphical capability. But I do find it very frustrating when gaming review companies like IGN, GameSpot, Kotaku, etc. hyper-focus on those numbers because I think it distracts from the more important conversations about gameplay consistency and clarity of art design. At the end of the day, those conversations are going to be infinitely more useful to the consumer than telling them which game is going to overheat their console the fastest. I think it's even more frustrating to rag on Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate of all games for its frame rate or technical capabilities. First of all, the game is pretty much a commodified nostalgia trip. I don't think anyone was going into the game expecting it to be this big paragon of graphical capability. Second of all, anyone who's actually played the game would know how well it runs. I mean, the loading times are extremely low, the textures are always loaded properly and are very defined, and the hitboxes are extremely well constructed. Third and finally, the argument for 60 frames per second is far more pertinent to competitive fighting games and twitchy first-person shooters. All of the attacks in Monster Hunter Generations are telegraphed heavily. They're all very slow and deliberate on your end and on the monster's end. So 60 frames per second would not actually make that big of a difference. Anyway, thank you so much for your comment. I know that the way that I put it in the original review was a bit reductive and hazy, and hopefully I've been able to clear it up a little bit. So let's move on to some healthy speculation about Monster Hunter Rise. Most of my takes on this issue boil down to wanting to take the best of both worlds, getting the best of the old style of Monster Hunter as exemplified by Generations Ultimate, and the best of the new style as exemplified by Monster Hunter World. In terms of combat, Monster Hunter World was a shift away from the risk-reward nature of the previous installments in favor of a more reactionary system. For the record, this is the exact same thing that Bloodborne did for the Dark Souls series, all the way down to being able to move while you're healing yourself. They took some of the risk away from actions that the player can take, like healing themselves or using other consumable items, and they compensated for that by making the monsters far more punishing. I think that things like the Vigor Wasps and the Vitality Mantle are taking it a bit too far, but in general I don't have a problem with seeing another reactionary style combat system like Monster Hunter World. So let's get a scoreboard going, okay? In terms of combat, Monster Hunter World wins. Now let's take a look at the second half of the gameplay, which is the preparation and inventory management. I'm going to take it as a given that the upgrading process will be exactly the same as it's always been, and also that there will be a Meowster chef making a multitude of mouth-watering meals. God, it's like if George R.R. Martin was programming a video game. The amount of changes that Monster Hunter World made to the combat pale in comparison to the changes made to the other aspects of the gameplay. Many of those can be boiled down to quality of life improvements, like increasing the number of item boxes, quest boards, and exits in the main base. I do want to point out how great it is that you can access your equipment from any item box in the home base. In Generations Ultimate, you had to go back to your personal quarters to change your equipment, and that was a huge pain in the neck. Generations Ultimate does reign supreme in the item pouch category though, especially with the implementation of Prowler mode. Monster Hunter World increased the number of items that you could carry in your item pouch at any one given time, which on the surface seems like a good thing, but it actually detracts from the importance of having an inventory limitation in the first place. I mean, think about it. Every single time you run out of space in your inventory, you have to make a decision as to what's important in your inventory to keep and whether or not the thing that you picked up is worth keeping in your inventory in the first place. As a result, the end goal of your gathering is always in the back of your mind, which only serves to increase the amount of satisfaction you get when you finally have all the materials you need to get your next upgrade, or craft your next potion or whatever. The point is you're more focused on the goal rather than just mindlessly picking up everything that you see. This isn't to say that Monster Hunter World's item pouch is broken, but it is the first step on a slippery slope that leads to Xenoblade Chronicles levels of inventory limitation. I'm going to have to give preparation and inventory management a draw. However, if they reinstate Prowler mode, the edge definitely goes towards Generations Ultimate. Please let me search for herbs and blue mushrooms as a puppy, please. The last category is visual design or art style, and Generations Ultimate has this one by a landslide. The environmental design specifically needs to be toned down a little bit from Monster Hunter World, at least. In a game where the main form of gameplay is combat, the environments need to be clear and defined so as to provide consistent feedback to the player. That's a stolen idea from Matthew Matosis, by the way, and here's another stolen idea. The clarity of a game's art style matters much more than its frame rate or resolution. By no means am I saying that Monster Hunter World does not provide consistent feedback to the player or that it's not clear enough, but that's the tightrope that you gotta walk when you start adding extraneous visual details. They're pretty, but games can't survive on pretty alone. On top of that, Rise is going to have to run on the Nintendo Switch, so obviously they're going to need to take a step back a bit in terms of graphics from World. Not only is it better for the hardware, but it's also better for the type of gameplay, so if I hear anyone complaining about the visual capability of Monster Hunter Rise when it comes out, I'm going to flip. So there you go, those are my predictions for Monster Hunter Rise. I guess I'm hoping that it'll be closer to Generations Ultimate than World, which tracks because, in general, I think that Generations Ultimate is more enjoyable for me than World was, and it makes sense for the console anyway. If you guys have your own predictions about Monster Hunter Rise, you can take a stroll on down to the comments section and let me know about that there. I'm also toying around with the idea of starting a Monster Hunter Discord, so if you guys are interested in that or you'd like to see anything like that in the future, then you could also let me know about that in the comments. There might be a link in the description, maybe not, I'm not sure. While I'm here, I might as well just ask you guys to subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and leave a like or dislike, whichever one you prefer. And I also have a Patreon that's up, and about the Patreon. So there isn't a lot of content on there as of yet, because I feel like at this stage it's more important for me to be growing the channel than it is to be making specific content for people who aren't even there yet. Except for Arbo, shout out to my man Arbo. So that's the deal with that. You can donate if you like. There's also a link to that in the description. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Don't lose your way.